Go Chiefs. Everybody, my name is Tim Dugan. I'm one of the owners of 2009. So we want to first thank everybody for coming out and second, supporting us as we start to create an event space and a really interesting campus down here on Vine Street. Give you a little context to the project and the buildings and the site. Myself and two other business partners purchased these buildings from the city about 4 or 5 years ago. This is the original water department, and this was the first public works campus of Kansas City. So this building was built in 1872 and was home to the water department. If you lived in the redlined portion of Kansas City, this was where you were required to pay your water bill. Next door was the street department, and it evolved in the early teens into Public Works and Parks and Rec East and Parks and Rec West, which was based on parks east of Troost or west of Troost in Kansas City. These buildings had been abandoned since 1978 and had seen better days. And then in addition to that, across the street was the Workhouse Castle. And you'll notice that all these beautiful stone buildings are limestone. They actually were quarried from the debtor's prison across the street. And they built these buildings and they laid the gravel and the cobble for the first 27 blocks of Kansas City. And so we as a group kind of thought, hey, let's kind of bring a vision back to this infrastructure campus, but through a different lens and a different approach. And we're trying to create amazing tenants and amazing partnerships and a collaborative network to create some real change, but also respect the cultural corridor that Vine Street is within Kansas City. And so tonight, I'd like to just kind of give the microphone a little bit to some of our amazing tenants, both in this building and are about ready to activate next door. Many of you have shared some of their food and drink and conversations tonight. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Shanita McAfee Bryant from Prospect KC.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you guys for all being here tonight. Every time, I've been on this project with them almost since they purchased the building. Their other business partner is a good friend and was like, hey, we're going to buy these buildings. You want to do something? I was like, yeah, I'll do something. I didn't know what it was going to be then, but I can tell you that I'm very happy with the evolution and where we are now. What we are going to open next door is what I'm calling my retirement phase of my culinary career. So you guys have known me for lots of different things, but I think that the Prospect KC is something that I'm going to be able to do that gives me an opportunity to build community and to give back to a community and a place that's given so much to me. So what we are is a workforce development program. We have a whole person model. I know I'm using weird words here for anybody who knows about workforce. They're like, whole person, what is that? Essentially, it's not a one-size-fits-all program. We do a lot of barriers assessment. We try to meet the people exactly where they are, and then we kind of work from there instead of being like, hey, here's your certificate. Thank you for coming to this program. Goodbye. So they get a really intensive 16-week boot camp with us, and then we go on and support them through every stage of that career advancement so that they can reach that sustained economic mobility for hopefully 2 years. After 2 years, I haven't done my job right. The other two things that we work on are food access and nutritional literacy. This is a food desert. I hate that word. I like the word apartheid. It's a system. It's working exactly the way that it was designed. And so we want to be a hub for people to be able to access nutritional, healthy food in an affordable way right over there. And then also giving them the skill set that they need. Anybody who knows anything about our community in particular, COVID really accelerated the death of the people who had the skills, right? We know our grandmothers, great-grandmothers, they can make $1 out of 15 cents. That skill set is gone, which is contributing to our younger generation not really knowing how to use food as fuel and medicine to feed themselves. So you'll be able to come over there soon and get coffee, and it's a very open kitchen, open space. When you're walking by the windows, you'll see the students baking and doing things. When you're standing there waiting on your coffee, you're going to be able to see them and interact with them. So thank you guys, and I look forward to seeing you next door soon. Oh, so we do have a couple of events coming up, and I have a QR code downstairs. I'll get it and put it on the table, but if you want to join our first bite, it's going to allow you to have the first bite, the first sip of coffee from over there. We have a really cool initiative that I'm really excited about. It's called the Neighborhood Account. It's basically throwing back in the 50s and 40s when you needed something. You just go down to the corner store, put it on the account, right? And if you settle, you do. If you don't, you don't. So what we're doing is asking our community to create a neighborhood account so that if people come there and they're a little short or they can't, it's no questions asked. They're just gonna flip the screen, put it on the neighborhood account. You guys will all help us fund that account, and then people can go and do the things that they need to do. So I'll bring that QR code up, but those are the two ways.
I will definitely be taking advantage of the neighborhood account, because, just kidding. All right, yeah. My name is Kemet Coleman. Not just some random guy who took the mic. I'm also one of the tenants here at 2000 Vine, starting Vine Street Brewing Co. We'll be open next door and joining Shanita. That's our sweet mate, as we call it. Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long time coming, but we're excited to be a part of this project. These buildings are near and dear to my heart. I grew up here in Kansas City and was wishing for more in the Jazz District because I learned so much about what it was and said, why aren't we doing that now here in Kansas City's, and the country? One of the country's most famous African-American neighborhoods and Kansas City's most famous neighborhood. So when we saw the space, when I saw the space back in 2018 or something like that, it was not as polished as what you see it today. It was in complete disarray, disrepair. It looked like an ancient ruin, to be honest with you. Stone building, no ceiling, no windows, trees growing out of it, all kinds of things, debris, graffiti everywhere. It just looked really bad. So I guess it takes a little bit of vision to have confidence in saying, like, hey, I want to do a project here one day. When COVID hit, it really allowed, Tim and his partners, Shamari and Jason, to, really dial in what they were trying to do and also simultaneously, this is kind of when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my career as a musician here in Kansas City, because that's mostly what I was known for before I started this project. Now I'm just the beer guy. When we came around after the pandemic, I asked my partners if they'd be willing to start a brewery here, and it would have been, and it will be, the first African-American brewery in Kansas City and in the state of Missouri. So thank you. So yeah, less than 1% of all breweries are black-owned in the United States. And for those who don't know, beer is Black history because it was founded in Africa. And so for me, it came full circle as someone who was named after one of Africa's greatest lands and spaces and actually the Egyptians invented beer as well. So it was really cool to come full circle and do that here in Kansas City. A place that was near and dear to me, and this is definitely a legacy project for my partners and myself and everybody involved, so hope you guys come out when we open.
Thank you so much, Kemet and Tim and Chef Shanita. Thrilled to see you all here tonight. For those of you who I have not met yet, Claire Bishop, Executive Director at American Public Square. Thrilled to be here in this awesome and amazing space, which you just got some opportunity to learn a little bit about. Think it's awesome what y'all are doing, and love to hear about the businesses that are building and growing community here, right here in this space. So. We're very excited to be hosting a conversation this evening with author Phil Allen Jr., and he will receive a proper introduction in just a moment. My job is a short one. It's the important job of introducing to you our moderator for this evening, Dr. Rodney Smith, who may not need an introduction to many of you. You probably know him and call him a friend. Rodney and his wife Stephanie own and operate a change management firm, Sofix Solutions, which many of you may have heard of. Is awesome. Dr. Smith is also serves as the vice president for access and engagement at William Jewell College, which is where American Public Square has our academic home, and we are just super pleased to be a part of that organization as well, that institution. That partnership has been really important and fruitful for us. We're also really pleased to welcome Rodney to our executive board of directors at American Public Square. He just joined in 2023, so making that connection even more. So in just 1 second, I'm going to hand the mic over to him so he can properly introduce our featured guest this evening, Phil Allen Jr., who has an incredible book, The Prophetic Lens, which we're going to be talking more about. But one last quick thing I want to do is make sure I give a shout out to the folks at Bliss Books and Wine who are over here in the back. They've got a grand opening coming up this weekend, too. They've got a space over there on Armour and Gillum. Yep, exactly. So check them out. They are awesome partners and have books on hand to sell this evening. So if you want to pick up a copy, make sure and go by and see the folks there. All right. Thank you so much. And over to Rodney.
Yeah. Good evening. So thank you all for being here. Realizing that you probably were busy doing other things today, and it's some game that happened over the weekend. Confession. I'll just put it this way. I was born in Philadelphia. So technically, I couldn't lose that game. Right? So it was a very exciting game. I think the two best teams in the NFL played. Yeah, I think the two best quarterbacks this year in the NFL played. So I think it was everything that we expected it to be. So congratulations, Kansas City Chiefs. Yeah. So I'm excited. In a lot of ways, the conversation that Phil and I are going to have tonight is an extension of conversations that we have often because he's my younger cousin. We grew up together in South Carolina. I was a football player. He was a basketball star. And literally, we grew up together from the time we were knee-high to a duck. And sometimes we often talk about, we imagined at this stage of our lives that we would have been retired from using our bodies, but now we use our brains for a living. And so I think that is pretty cool stuff. I'm going to read a bit of his bio so you'll know him better, and then we'll jump into some questions that I've prepared. But we'll also want to engage you all in an opportunity to ask some questions of Phil as we engage in this discussion. So Phil Allen Jr. is a PhD candidate at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he is a Pennell Center for Black Church Studies Fellow. As an emergent ethicist and theologian, his research integrates Black church theology and praxis, a theology of justice, healing racial trauma, and fostering ethics of racial solidarity. He is a speaker, a poet, documentary film producer, a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. He's also founder and executive director of the Racial Solidarity Project based out of Pasadena, California. And as a former Division I college basketball player, he has enjoyed opportunities as a guest chaplain for several colleges and professional sports teams, one of which he serves as a chaplain for the Dallas Cowboys. Boo! Boo! Our football coach, when we were growing up, used to say the only thing worse than a Dallas Cowboy fan is two of them. So, it's personal, right? I mean, as an Eagles guy in Dallas, yeah. I don't want to use the word hate, but strongly dislike. But anyway, y'all ain't cut to hear that.
I do have some love for KC. They drafted my uncle in 1971, so I keep a little love for them.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we'll jump right in. I've prepared a few questions, and then we'll just, I'm sure you appreciate this as a preacher, and My mom, as a Southern Baptist minister, she says often, let the Spirit lead you. And so I'm going to just let the Spirit lead us today. But also make sure you keep us on time, because I am the son of a Baptist minister, and he is a minister. So we get a little long-winded from time to time. So make sure. Right. In other words, I have an appreciation for a podium and a microphone, but or a stand and an audience and a microphone, if you will. But the first question I have, Phil, I think the book title is provocative. I think it's interesting. It's not a title that we've heard before, and the topic that you were trying to address in the book is, I think, a fresh way of looking at social justice. And so would you share with us the impetus for the book? What sparked the reason why you even wrote this book? Sure.
First of all, thank you all for coming out this evening. I don't take your time and your presence for granted. There's several layers to what led to writing this book. The first, and Luke, you can appreciate this, at Sundance Film Festival 2019, we were there with an organization called Windrider, and they curate space for Christians and Christian filmmakers, but also non-Christians, to talk about film through a theological lens, if you will, to kind of bring those worlds together. And I'm sitting I'm watching films all week, and I saw a film called Always in Season, and it's a history on lynching, but it also talks specifically about a young man, now about 9-10 years ago, was found hung in Bladensboro, North Carolina. And so the film centers around his story, but it also tells the history of lynching in this country. And so much of his story paralleled my grandfather's story. So the first book I wrote, called Open Wounds, tells the story of my grandfather's murder in 1953. My family never received justice. And my grandmother, so the theme of that book is intergenerational trauma from racial tragedy, right? And so sitting in the forum, I shared that story, and that's what sparked this book, which came from the paper I wrote for that class, because it was a class that I was there for. So the title of that paper was The Prophetic Lens. And so much of the film, so many of the films at Sundance, we won't ever see in theaters. Because in theaters, it's meant to entertain us and draw us. We want to go and see them and feel good and walk away. Oh, that's an amazing story. But Sundance, by day 2, you're tired. You're worn out because they're dealing with real subject matters. Like, nothing is off the table. And so being there that week and that idea of these films being prophetic, and I can talk about that in a little bit as well, it sparked the paper that led to this, initially led to this book. But fast forward 2021, a year after George Floyd's murder, Derek Chauvin's trial. I'm watching the trial, and I'm realizing, like many people probably would agree, that the star was the video footage. If there was no video, he would not have even been arrested, because Minneapolis Police Department had already given a statement that was not a reflection of what happened. But they didn't know that Darnella Frazier had the resiliency and the presence of mind to stand with the camera in intimate proximity to what was happening, and she didn't turn away. That's prophetic action. She was uncovering something. She was revealing something. So watching that trial, and I watched as much of it as I possibly could, and I said, I gotta turn that paper into a book. And I'm in the middle of writing my dissertation, doing my proposal, so I shouldn't be writing nothing else but that, be honest. But I knew if I had waited too long, it may have been a little irrelevant, but now I see Uvalde and other, Tyree Nichols, the camera is not going away. So that was what inspired me to write that story. And lastly, same thing for the first book, Open Wounds. So many people talk about, can't we just move on? People think the solution to this issue of racism And I don't like to talk about racism. I like to talk about white supremacy because that's the undergirding root of racism. The actions, the stuff that we see is racism, but underneath that is an ideology. But people think the solution is can't we just move on and get along type of thing? No. We got to be made aware of how we even got here in the first place. And so I embarked on writing this book, and I'm glad I did.
Man. It's so many questions I want to, now I'm thinking, why did I even write these questions? Because you said so much to unpack there. One, I was privy to you having a conversation with some students this morning at Jewel about your understanding of even the word prophetic. And then how can we tie that back into, you used the term, I was going to ask you to define racism. I still would like to ask you to define racism, but also unpack, I think, white supremacy, because I think it is a concept that many of us misunderstand. Even racism, I think, is a concept that many of us misunderstand. So I know I piled a lot on you right there, but prophetic, racism, white supremacy.
Okay. Prophetic. So I use Walter, in the book, I use Walter Brueggemann. He's an ethicist and theologian. Love his work. In Prophetic Imagination, he talks about, he defines prophetic, what it means to be prophetic for us. And I loved how he framed it. And he used the Egyptians, the Israelites versus Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And he calls Pharaoh, he describes Pharaoh and the Egyptians as the royal regime, the dominant consciousness. And obviously everyone is subject to that. And the job of the royal regime is to keep everything as is. Don't change anything because it's working. But Moses comes in with something different. This is where prophetic comes in. And he says prophetic ministry criticizes, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but criticizes the royal consciousness, the dominant consciousness of the society, and then offers an alternative consciousness. But when it criticizes, it is also energizing. So it's not just being a cultural critic and complaining about what's happening, it's exposing what's happening, and also the other part is to energize a counter community to put forth this alternative consciousness or perspective. And I think that's what the camera does. It exposes what's happening, what's been hidden in the underbelly. The stuff that I knew was happening, many of you know what's happening, but the world doesn't necessarily know what's happening more regularly than we think. Exposes it and then energizes, as we saw in 2020. The summer of 2020, yes. There was an energy.
Yes.
There were people, I ministered for 7 years in a white conservative evangelical space. There were people marching that I had to do a double take on social media to make sure it was the right person I saw marching, because they would never have done that, right? So there was an energy. Now, that's a whole other conversation as to whether or not that energy has been sustained. But there was an energy, there was something that was sparked. And that's what the camera did. That's what I mean by being prophetic, to criticize, but also to offer an alternative consciousness. So we talk about policy reform. We talk about, we're having conversations like this.
Right. Spaces
like this are curated, right? Racism, we throw that term around. Many people use that term. It's more than just bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination. That is an aspect of racism. But it is a system that organizes society around a racial hierarchy. So these are key words that we can't leave out of the definition. Organizes society. Racial hierarchy, not just bigotry, right? And it's also, so I'm just going to throw some bullet points rather than try to just define it clearly, but just some bullet points.
Right.
But it's also not just an interpersonal issue.
Right.
It's group dynamics. It was never intended to just be about me versus another individual, a black person versus a white person, Asian person versus it wasn't just that, it was group dynamics. We can go back to Plato and Aristotle before there was the language of racism. They call it, some people call it proto-racism, where the same narratives that we are dealing with today, the Egyptians and the Romans were projecting those same narratives, labels, meanings onto Ethiopians. Same ones. And also tying those things to theology, to faith, to religion, to solidify. And then later you had science, pseudoscience, that was used to validate the mythology around race, this invention. There's no such thing as race. But society was organized around racial hierarchy that gives access to certain groups and disadvantages other groups. That's why you can't just look at it from an individual standpoint. Because ever since the very beginning, there's always been, even the Europeans had to negotiate with some African to get the slaves. So there was always some Africans that got through. But the groups were affected differently. And when we talk about privilege, people cringe a lot of times. But it's a thing, right? But here's what people don't really think about. It's not just access to resources, decision-making, access to the table. It's also insulation from. And I tell my white brothers and sisters, we have one-on-one conversations all the time, and I share with them, there's certain things you don't have to think about. There's certain things that you're insulated from. That in and of itself, I'll give you an example. There are things as a man I'm insulated from. I don't have to deal with. And women know what, they know that. You know what I'm talking about. I always use that kind of, these examples. There are advantages that I do have. I recognize that as a man, right? And so with that, I have to understand how how society has been arranged based on gender and how I have been given advantage and access to things, but I've also been insulated from things that they don't have to experience. Same thing with race. White supremacy is simple. It's this ideology, this idea that European or white, light-skinned people are inherently superior to darker-skinned people. Plain and simple. Some scholars would rely upon, they call it the environmental theory, that the environment is what caused the differences. And I do believe that environment does cause the difference in skin complexion. You know, you grow up in certain areas, you're born in Africa, and where the climate is different than where it would be in, say, Russia, there's going to be differences physically. But they also attach that to character, intellect, right. The capacity to have imagination. The whole being of a person was attached to that theory. And it was all to support this idea that Europeans were superior to Africans on the wide spectrum. But you had the different groups in between. But there's another part that people don't think about, is white sovereignty. Supremacy is the value, the quality of a thing. Sovereignty is the authority in the thing. It's one thing to say, this person, this is the standard for beauty, this is a substandard for beauty. It's another thing to say, I have the authority to make that decision. And so we got to deal with that part of it as well, not just white supremacy, but white sovereignty. And I say to my white brothers and sisters often, it affected you too. It's affected all of us. It has stripped even Europeans of their ancestry, right. Of their identity. Ethnicity. When that term white was created in the 17th century, because prior to that, people would look at you strange if you said you're a white person. There was no such thing as white. You'd be identified by your ancestry, where you were from. And so this invention comes up, and it actually, I had a young man, a PhD student, I'm gonna stop right here. I had a PhD student say to me, I said something to him in a lecture, and he said, but if I'm not white, then who am I? I said, I said, I don't have the answer to this, but you're gonna have to go back to a time before you were white.
I don't know what to ask now. Well, y'all got some questions? Wow. Yeah. There's so much I want to say. You said something. There's so much you said, man. And I love the breaking down and the better understanding of, because in fact that's the work that my wife and I do in a lot of ways here in the city and elsewhere around the country, and trying to get people to understand that, especially with regard to racism and white supremacy, is not necessarily about intentional hate. It's about an identity standard that has been woven through our society that has granted advantage, is the word that I love to use, and disadvantage for others. Advantage for some, disadvantage for others. Yes?
Could you loop what you just said back around to visionary things, like the photos of like the photos of lynching in newspapers, or like, could you talk about what you've just talked about? Could you bring that back around to the lens? And I realized in early days the lens was a painting or something else. Could you wrap that around for us to kind of bring the circle together?
If I understand you correctly, when you mean my definitions.
Your definitions, how do they reflect it?
While you thinking, let me try.
Yeah, give me a minute.
And not necessarily, I'm going to take it in the opposite direction. I want him to address your question. But this is an exercise that my wife and I use when trying to get people to understand white supremacy. And I want you to do this exercise, a thought exercise with me. How old were you when you first remember seeing a white image of Santa Claus? How old were you? You can't even remember, can you? You've always seen a white image of Santa Claus. Likewise, how old were you when you saw an Asian image of Santa Claus? That's white supremacy. In fact, we were just talking about Minnesota. A few years back, there was an African-American gentleman portraying Santa Claus in the mall. And many of our white brothers and sisters in Minnesota began to take to the streets, basically, and hit newspaper articles and things of that nature, saying that is a black man portraying Santa Claus in the mall. Santa Claus is not black, Santa Claus is white. Santa Claus ain't real. Right? Cover your ears, those of you who still believe in Santa Claus. Similarly, what's going on right now with the Little Mermaid? I'm no scientist, I'm no marine biologist, and I know they're still looking for mermaids. But from what I understand right now, today, we have not found any. And it's based on Disney. Right? So why are we up at arms that an African-American actress or actor is portraying the Little Mermaid? It's Disney. That's white supremacy. It's an expectation that it can't be any other image than a white image.
So let's go here. Let's go down this road. Jesus.
Oh. Preach, preacher.
Maybe we close our ears again. But tying this idea of white supremacy, racism, especially as he just so eloquently shared, that's just woven into the fabric and the visual, tying it back to the visual. I think that is the most potent visual, because it's linking whiteness to divinity, right? Which has always been used to undergird, to reinforce the notion, right? During antiquity, the Greeks and the Romans, when they would have revelations about what demons looked like, they would always describe them as Ethiopians. And they would document this. So just think about this. If I'm always describing demonic, satanic, as an actual person, not a monster, a figure with horns, but an African. And then I'm likewise simultaneously tying God with whiteness. What does that condition? How does that condition a society intergenerationally? Right? And so visual has always, long before the camera, it's always been a powerful tool to perpetuate this ideology. I share, when I've lectured in a couple of classes, I've said this, and the first time I ever said it just came out. I wasn't planning on it, it just came out. I ain't even gonna blame it on the Spirit, it just came out. I said, because Christianity is so rooted in our culture, it's the dominant religion in our culture, right? It still carries some weight. No matter what people think about it, the church is declining, it still carries weight. We won't change until we see God as black. I'm not saying necessarily God was looking like me or he's an African. I'm really saying symbolically. But I do believe he was brown-skinned with coarse hair. But symbolically, he was poor, he was rejected, he was marginalized, he was a refugee, he was falsely accused, he was crucified, and he died, right? He was never linked with earthly power. He was always linked with those on the margins. Until we see Jesus as one on the margins, until I see Jesus as the homeless person on the street, what you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And so I think that's where a lot of the breaking down needs to happen, not just with Santa Claus, but there's something there too. Right. But certainly with this connection between whiteness, this idea of whiteness, and divinity being equal. If that answers your question, I'm not sure it does not.
Let me get the mic to you, because our recording is not going to be complete unless we hear your great question.
Yes.
That'd be great. It is. Would you explain why you believe Jesus had brown skin, coarse hair?
Skin of bronze, hair like wool.
That's it. Somebody else had a question here in the middle. Oh, Lou.
And real
I'm
quick,
coming.
and if you trace his lineage,
We need to hear you on the mic.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
and if you trace his lineage, you will see there's African lineage in his blood. So I doubt if he was dark as me, but definitely more probably like a Palestinian today. He would look more familiar than what we're used to.
So, Rodney, this question could be for you. It could be for Mr. Allen. But let's go back when you speak about how the camera has really a face of its own, basically. Can you speak about white supremacy and white sovereignty when it comes to the media and how it really speaks to society and what it looks like from either side. That's a mindset.
So I'm gonna share a story that's in the book.
Thank you.
When I was a kid, growing up in Georgetown, South Carolina, on the news from Charleston, all I saw were images of black men as criminals. Almost every night, certainly every week.
Very true.
Mugshots, what have you. To the point where I had internalized the messaging that the media had fed me. I internalized it to where if I was afraid to go to Charleston as a kid because I thought I would come in contact with people, young men that looked like me, and something bad was going to happen to me. It wasn't until I was older that I realized that wasn't necessarily the case. I started playing football against many of these guys, and many of them were cool. I'm like, oh, that's not what they're like. So the media may be the biggest culprit in perpetuating the narratives around race, both in what it projects onto and how it presents representation, how it presents people, white, black, Asian, what have you, but also in the absence. So if I never see myself represented in a positive, in intelligent ways, in well-dressed way, if I see myself as the criminal often enough, not just me, but others are internalizing that message and will actually end up believing it. And we've been trying to undo that messaging for decades. Going back to Birth of a Nation, which that has its own chapter in the book as well. The film Birth of a Nation began this narrative, particularly of the black man as a threat, right? And I talk about Oscar Micheaux, I talk about John Singleton, I talk about Spike Lee, Ava DuVernay, and the prophetic use of the film from a black perspective. And now we can say from an Asian perspective as well, Native perspective as well. It's the democratization now that's allowing us to be able to disrupt those narratives and tell a fuller picture, not just of suffering, but of beauty. We talked about how the narrative of black men not being in the lives of their sons, especially athletes, and it's way more common than we think to see black fathers in the lives, going to the games, helping their kids train, and loving their sons, but that's not what the media shows, because that doesn't sell. Right? And so, it's a great question, great point that the media is one of the biggest culprits, purveyors of this false narrative, these false narratives.
Here, I'll trade you.
No, I think I'm in. I'm on. Mic check, 1, 2. So you spoke about how it perpetuates in a black community.
Yes.
Now speak about how it perpetuates from the hate from the white community.
Going back to Birth of a Nation, being one of the first, if not the first film, number one, it feeds the narrative of supremacy, the ideology of supremacy. It starts there, right? And then it feeds the narrative of othering. When it feeds that, then it also has to show how the other is disrupting the security, the preservation, the prosperity of the white community. That's just how it works. That's not my opinion. That's just how it works. It presents a narrative that first has to support what's already believed. It has to present a second narrative, antagonist, that's going to be a threat to what's already believed. And then it has to show what needs to happen to keep this. So this is not disrupting, because this is working. And so depending on a person's security, level of intelligence, they can take parts of these narratives and run with it, and it just kind of fosters dislike and disdain for the other. Now, we can say that for any group. We can say it for class, we can say it for gender, we can say it wealthy folks, poor people. We can say it across the board. Sexuality, we can say that, right? But society, the preeminent force that organized society is around race. That's why we have to start there, and we can't be afraid to have that conversation. I hope that answered your question.
Between you and Brother Lou, you kind of touched on, but I want to go back to what you talked about sovereignty, white sovereignty. I remember growing up, and even now in some ways, if something tragic happened and if there was no immediate image of the perpetrator or a mention of their race, I knew it was a white person. Because it was, right? You knew it was, because the leading language, if it was a person of color, is black man, instantly a picture. Even if the black person was a victim, they'll find some image, right? And so that sovereignty piece really hits home because you talk about the power to do so. And so when we think about this being more than just interpersonal, which I appreciate that, I want to lift us up higher to when we think about systems. And Chef Shanita talked about this at the beginning when she talked about it's not a food desert, it is food apartheid. It is a system, and systems produce predictable outcomes. Brother Larry and I were talking about predictable outcomes, right? And so can you talk about it from a systems level? What are the shifts? What are the things that we should be advocating for, convening ourselves around? Those of us that are hope mongers, right? What is that systemic shift that can help us when we think about narratives? Because I feel this is a big theme about narratives.
Great question. I don't know if it's going to fully answer your question, but the first thing that comes to my mind is personnel. Who's at the table of decision making? Because that sets the tone for culture, and that approves or disapproves of the systems in place. So when I planted my church 7 years ago, my board was half and half men, women, half and half, like not half and half, but multiracial. Because I needed the cultures that I'm not familiar with to be represented. And so that we could establish culture from top down rather than bottom up. Because this still allows for a level of control within the systems. Right? You can still predict your outcomes. You can still have the predictable outcomes because you still have a level of control. Up here is the relinquishing of control. So I think it starts with personnel, in my opinion. Nothing changes until the decision-making table looks differently. Representation. Shared leadership, shared power. I think language is important. Basis for any society, for culture, is language. So the language that we use, that's why I appreciate, where did she go, Chef? She left? But I appreciate how she shifted the language from, and you mentioned, from desert to apartheid. Now you're framing things very differently. It's a new lens. Language gives us a new lens. So those are the first two things that come to mind. We can talk about regulation, we can talk about policies and everything, but all that stems also from who's in power to write those things and change those things. So those are the first two things that come to my mind.
Yeah, I think part of it, babe, the work that we do, I think is telling the truth.
Babe.
Being honest about our history and the significance and importance of it. And, especially with regard to your point, Phil, about this idea of language, I think that's why we even shifted. If you've noticed in society today, especially like we're in Black History Month, we're talking about, we use language like enslaved Africans as opposed to just slaves. Because if you have those who have been enslaved, you then must have an enslaver. It's a part. It has to have a relationship, and that's why I like to use language that, when we talk about the underserved community, we also have to address the overserved community, because there is indeed the truth, right? Oppositely, or we are in the red line district or formerly red line district, and we have to also talk about the formerly green line district. So we have to educate ourselves, in other words, about how this system was created, and people, it wasn't simply behavior that created the circumstances in which people live. Nobody chooses to live in abject poverty because they just want to be poor.
Dr. Allen, I have a question for you, because I appreciate all the information that you're sharing, your perspectives, so helpful. One of the things that I'd like to think about is how, as a white person, can I use my privilege in a positive and productive way? 3 stories I heard yesterday, or no, today actually. 3 stories I've heard in the last 24 hours. The first was a story yesterday about brainwashing, and that brainwashing is real, and that if you repeat it enough times, even you begin to believe it, even if it never happened. So that was the first story. The second story was about the heinous murders in Buffalo and the perpetrator being sentenced today to life in prison, which, frankly, from my perspective, is not enough. And then the third story was from Nikki Haley, who has announced her candidacy for presidency. And today, in a session, she said, "I'm the first female governor of a state, and I'm here to tell you that we are not a racist nation." So I thought, and frankly, saying nothing about politics, and I recognize she's an Asian or Indian American, but what was so crazy to me was the juxtaposition of those 3 stories, right? So we're talking about brainwashing. If you say something to yourself enough times, you begin to believe it. 2, somebody commits a heinous act that's absolutely racially motivated. He even said it today in court. And 3rd, a leader of our nation getting up and saying we are not a racist nation. So I say all of that to ask you, what can we do about it?
So here's usually my answer when people say, what do we do? What can I do? I think that's a step ahead of where we need to be. I'm always asking the question, who do you want to become? Because your doing will come out of your being. If you want to fix it, then you can go and jump into doing, right? But if you really want something to be sustained, then because you're going to be doing from a place rather than growing and evolving and maturing to a place, and let your doing come out of that, right? So in my first book, I talk about listen, learn, lament, labor. And those 4 L's, that's the preacher in me, the alliteration, I'm sorry. But those 4 L's came from an actual interaction with some white classmates of mine that I just had to write it down because it was so powerful, the experience we had. We've heard about the listening and learning part. I think that's pretty common, right? But it's listening to learn that I think a lot of times that we forget. Listening, but then learning from. Listening to learn, but learning from. So the question is, who are you learning from? You talk about brainwashing, because if you say something long enough, you start to believe it. So now you have to have someone else come in and offer you a different perspective to counter that. But here's the important part, lament. We don't lament as a nation just in general. We're ready to be strong and tough and move on. I watched a documentary with a small group of people at church this past weekend, and as soon as we finished the documentary, it was on redlining in Pasadena, and I had not seen it before. I didn't even know the history, and I was grieving. I mean, I was almost in tears. And the moderator, the guy who put the event on, wanted to jump right into the conversation. As soon as, literally, when the credits stopped, he was like, "So Phil is going to have," and I just looked at him, and by the time he finished saying his piece, I said, "I need a minute." I need a minute. Some of us are still grieving George Floyd. Some of us are still grieving Trayvon. Some of us are still grieving Emmett Till. I'm still grieving my grandfather. My grandmother was grieving for the rest of her life. She took it to the grave with her. Her brother told me that. She took that pain to the grave. She never got over it. To the point where she couldn't even talk to her grandson about the murder 60 years earlier. My father, he used drugs all his life. He's sober now, the last 4 years, praise God, but all my life, my father was addicted. And when his brother passed and his mother passed 6 months after that, his psychotherapist said, you're grieving your brother and your mother. And he told me that, and I said, Dad, do you think you're grieving your father? He said, I never knew my dad. I said, that's my point. He had never thought about it. Trauma doesn't leave. It needs to be tended to, attended to. So I would love to stop right there at lament, but we can't sit there forever. We have to still be able to move forward. So the other part is be in coalition with people where you don't have the power. I'm going to go back to the gender issue. I need to be in coalition, in solidarity with women where I don't have power. I'm listening to you. What do you need? Right? Same thing when it comes to race. Find out what's needed and how you can provide it, because you don't want to bring paternalism to the table, right? But the lament piece, I think, is critical in the humbling of that. So I think taking that part seriously, and I think your context will determine the labor, what you ought to do. But it's the becoming part that I'm most concerned about. Hopefully that makes sense.
We have one over here, and then we can.
And I'm going to do a little better job facilitating. We're going to have Glenn, this young lady right in front of me, and then, ma'am, did I see your hand up earlier? Okay, all right.
All right, so I always get shut down when I bring this up, or have been recently. But when you talk about generational trauma, and you talk about lament, and you talk about the prophetic lens, I, about a year ago, saw a film clip of an escaped enslaved person who was being burned in front of other enslaved people while the slave owner danced the waltz with his wife and their rich friend. And I couldn't watch the rest of that film. I was too hurt. But then I thought about, what does a white person viewing that same clip feel if they are a caring white person, our white brothers and sisters, as you said, and they look at that, is there generational trauma there too that needs to be dealt with?
We talked about that today.
I wouldn't even say a caring white person. I would say a human. You can't escape that. Real quick, a man came up to me after a sermon. I was telling a story about my grandfather preaching justice, blah, blah, blah. And he says to me at the end of the sermon, end of the service, he says, in tears, probably in his 60s, I saw pictures, so many pictures of my grandfather standing next to lynched black bodies growing up. Wow. And he was almost shaking as in sharing with this. So my sermon brought that to the surface for him. There's something in his body. His nervous system was not designed to see those images. There's something called perpetrator-induced trauma. I'm still studying that, so don't ask me what it all means. I'm still looking into that myself. But there is a trauma, and Resmaa Menakem, in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, he talks about trauma, racial trauma, particularly in black bodies and in bodies of color, but also in white bodies. And that was new for me. And it's not centering white bodies again, but it is bringing bringing them to the table of trauma and asking, I invite them to reflect on what it has done to you, what you have seen. Because I always ask the question, how does every generation continue to either commit the violence or watch it? There's something going on that our bodies hold on to that we should take seriously, including my white brothers and sisters, to tend to what's going on here. What may have been passed on to me? Why can't I feel? Why can't I empathize? Why am I not in tears when I see, you see what I'm saying? So thank you for that question, man. I hope that answered your question.
I mean, I agree with you. When those situations robs people of color of their humanity, I think our white brothers and sisters are losing some of their humanity at the same time in order to be able to accomplish those things, to do those things. I mean, because think about it. I can't even see if I hit a squirrel, I'm having a visceral response, or I'm gonna wreck my car to try not to hit it, right? So there's something had to have happened to those who witnessed the death of a human. I can't believe otherwise.
Think about an entire generation of kids that went out to see those lynched bodies. It was a thing. It was like a big deal. And they would dismember the bodies and they would burn the bodies. Children were there watching that. Our souls were not designed as humans to witness that and absorb that and be okay.
And especially in celebration. Yes, ma'am.
So you've done a great job giving us some definitions of things, but as I've watched you, looked at you speak, I see 3 words behind you. It says Black moral agency, and I'd like to know what that means to you.
So one of the things that we've had to recover is agency as Black people. I mean, just going back 400 years, just on this continent, this country, is our agency. What white supremacy has done was establish this standard or bar for what is moral, what is right, what is wrong, as well as having all the agency. What the camera does was, using Darnella Frazier, for example, was give her agency, one, and moral agency, I would say, to stand in the midst of law enforcement on the knee on the neck of a Black man, and to be able to have the resiliency to exercise her agency, her moral agency. This is not right. I'm not going anywhere. You will be held accountable. And so the camera has also given, because it's been democratized, I mean, we all have our camera smartphones. It's given us this moral agency, this permission to stand, to do what's right, to hold accountable. So the camera is what I hope this is clearing, brings some clarity. But the camera is a part of that, this collective Black moral agency that we're no longer afraid to shy away from. Now we can assert that in spaces and hopefully bring about justice, equity, reform, what have you, if that makes sense. Well, she had...
I thought this young lady, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate your comment, Dr. Allen. And yeah, thanks, Dr. Smith, too, Rodney. No, this is really good. I struggle with a lot. And when it comes to thinking about race and trying not to see people through the lens of race, I'm curious to know how we, through our eyes, those are our lenses, right, personally, for each human, in terms of looking at how we can use media, how we can use education, how we can use the pulpit, hopefully in places of faith, in a collective way to help draw our lenses, our eyes, and then also what we hear in a more unified fashion to get away from race. And I mean, obviously, and I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that, as far as also trying to get to the space where that's not the first thing you think of when you see someone, in terms of what you said, that hierarchy. It's like looking at, okay, that apple is red, that apple is green. It's like, it's still an apple, and I'm not making judgment on one, one is better than the other. That's what I mean. So like not having judgment by what you see if someone's skin is darker or lighter. And, with younger kids, they don't see that. It's taught, right? I mean, I think that has been very well established, but I'm just curious in terms of how we can try to collectively kind of that laboring piece, help people see that through their lenses, like, hey, what's going on? Because so much of it, I believe, is just lack of awareness. I also think as a white person, there's probably shame. Once you do become aware of like, oh my God, when I think of the word heritage, I used to be very proud of American heritage. And then when I understood more of really what that meant, it's kind of a covert sort of, that language is around Civil War, it's around Confederacy, it's around slavery, so I wasn't aware of that growing up. And there's so much that I wasn't taught, in schools. And so I guess I know I'm long-winded, but in terms of trying to get at the educational system, to trying to get the places of faith, like collectively working together to help us have the lenses of and see what's really happening.
Yes.
Okay. Great question.
And let me do some facilitation. We're going to go to this lady next, and then Luke will be the last question of the night.
Okay. So, one, if I remember correctly about not seeing race, it not being the first thing, I don't want to not see race right now. I don't believe stepping away from it is going to help. It's going through it. Because here's the thing. I don't want you to judge me according to my race, but because of the reality of where we live, I need you to see me. Because we have different experiences. In the same way, I can't look at a woman and not see a woman. You have different experience than I have as a man in this world. That's just a reality. So I wish, ideally I would love to be there, but in reality, we have to go through it. I want you to see this. This has been through some stuff, right? The other part, I talk so much, I forgot what your second part was. If it comes back to me, I'm going to circle back.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Started thinking about the organizations you mentioned at the way at the beginning. I think white supremacy and how the organization. Rewind back so that it's in context to the idea of organization that you had mentioned. And I always think of institutions. As an educator, secondary education, I oftentimes looked at the English department's literature list. And it always clicked in my head. Where I taught school is more of a smaller community, more of a half rural, half city type of community. So my question is to you, if you've given thoughts on that, where do you see our educational system possibly going, and how high does it play into or specifically literature, that students receive, how high does it play into the organizational structure that we have in existence right now?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, my big sigh when you asked the question about our educational system, and we all know that the attack that we're under with regard to suppressing information, and so I think in a lot of ways, we have to decide, especially those of us who are educators. Yes, we have to decide that should be a part of our protests. Phil was talking about in 2020 where people took to the streets and protest. That is not the only way we can protest. Your protest, and so I even was sharing on the campus that I work. in a lot of ways, the work that I'm doing now, especially in the month of February, is my form of protest to talk about, I'm going to tell the truth about our country, regardless if others want me to tell the truth or not. And I think that I would encourage others who have that position and power to exercise that position and power to begin to tell the truth, because the truth of the matter is, facts aren't frightening. They're facts. And we learn from those facts. I think we become better as a result of it. And so ultimately, I think at the end of the day, though, I think true education is the discovery of self, that we have to do the job of recognizing who we are within the arrangement. And then this goes back to Elena's question of leveraging who we are to the assistance of others. I often use the analogy, especially here in Black History Month, Harriet Tubman has always been my mark. Whereas, you know, this notion of education does not equate to just the end result is not money. We often say, go get a good education so you can get a good job, make a lot of money. That cannot be the outcome of education. The outcome of education, back to my Harriet Tubman piece, is freedom. Freedom. But we can't stop there. So what is the intended outcome of freedom? Is for you to create it for others. Harriet Tubman obtained freedom for herself, was not satisfied, devised a system to where she wanted to create freedom for others, risking her freedom over and over again to do so. So you wonder what you should do with your advantage and your privilege, leverage it for those who have less advantage and less privilege. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I am the son of a Baptist preacher. Last question.
Is it fair to say that the camera also can cultivate a moral courage?
Are you saying the camera or the entire context? Because I believe, and I think I talk about this in the book, if we watch Darnella Frazier,
yes,
I don't know how we're not inspired to be more courageous. Who watches a traumatic event for 9 minutes and some change and doesn't move while she's being traumatized? She didn't ask for it. She was a withstander in that moment. If you look at your books, when I sign withstander, keep being a withstander. I think it is a model for us. Not the camera on the surveillance pole or the wall that captures something, or the body camera, but that person who says, and we can go back to the civil rights movement with those white cameramen who risked their lives. Their lives were threatened too, but they held ground, and they watched. They allowed the camera to be able to say, years later, I was there. I was there. So I think what we see in Darnella Frazier is a model of courage and should inspire us to act in similar ways. And I think I just remembered about how do we change the lens. I think intimacy changes the lens. I think proximity changes the lens. I think the closer, the more I get to know you, the more you get to know me, I guarantee you will have a different perspective of one another. That happens individually and it happens collectively, being in closer proximity. This space can change lenses. It may not change everyone. Everyone may not agree with everything that's said. I guarantee you, I'm willing to bet you somebody walked away with a shift in their lens, an adjustment in the lens, and they see things a little more clearly. I mean, I always walk away from this space with some adjustment in my lens. So I'm gonna end right there. I hope you go and sell out Bliss Books and Wine.
Absolutely.
And thank you for being here.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. You beautiful people, you courageous people. You know, I appreciate you being here. And a lot of times we have these kinds of conversations. They are couched as courageous conversations and difficult dialogues. But I'd like to say thank you for engaging in this dialogue of discovery, conversation of community. You beautiful people. And Phil, I wanted to thank you, man. As my younger cousin. I said this to you the other night on the phone. I'm proud of you, bro. I love you, man. You know, I jokingly say, I look up to you for a couple of reasons. Even though you're my younger cousin. Partly because you're taller than I am. But man, you're doing some powerful work, brother. You're powerful work, man. I'm proud of you, bro. So if you enjoyed tonight, and I'm being a part of the American Public Square as the newest board member of the American Public Square, we'd invite you to join American Public Square. I can't remember the levels. I'd encourage, in fact, I'm supposed to bring Claire back up to talk about that.
Can say that is going to add to that. That's it. You can learn more about APS at our website, American Public Square. We have really been thrilled to host this conversation. Thank you both.
Absolutely.
And thank you all.
Thank you, APS.